France sent its entire army. One African general held them off for 16 straight years, and won 90% of the battles. They outnumbered him. They outgunned him. They had the backing of the most powerful empire in Europe, a colonial machine funded by centuries of extracted wealth. And still, he made them bleed for every inch of ground. When it was finally over, France had spent the equivalent of $200 million in modern currency, buried thousands of its finest soldiers in the West African soil, and watched one African man, rewrite every assumption they had ever carried about the continent they thought they owned. His name was Samori Touré. And if you have never heard that name spoken with the reverence it deserves, that is not an accident. That is a policy. To understand Samori Touré, you have to understand what West Africa was before the French arrived with their maps and their muskets and their mission civilisatrice. This was not empty land. This was not a wilderness waiting to be named. By the mid-19th century, the interior of West Africa was a living, breathing commercial civilization. The Niger River corridor, stretching from present-day Guinea through Mali and into Nigeria, functioned as one of the great economic arteries of the world. Gold dust moved through Kankan and Bamako. Kola nuts, salt, iron, and cattle traded across networks that stretched thousands of miles. Merchants and scholars moved freely between cities. The Monde people, from whom Samori descended, had been at the center of this commerce for centuries, tracing their heritage back to the Mali Empire and before that to the great trading networks that predated European contact entirely. Samori Touré was born around 1830 in the village of Meniamboladiou, in what is now the Kankan region of Guinea. He was Diala by culture, a trading people, merchants by tradition, Muslims by faith. His early life gave no obvious signal of what was coming. He worked as a trader in his youth, traveling the gold and cola routes, learning the languages and the politics of dozens of different peoples across the region. But when slavers captured his mother, Samori did something that would define the rest of his life. He volunteered himself into the service of the warlord who held her, choosing bondage over abandonment. He spent years inside that military structure, watching, learning, absorbing every principle of how power was built and maintained through armed force. When he emerged, he carried with him an education that no European military academy could have provided. By the 1860s, Samori had begun the project of state building. He was patient, methodical, and ruthless when the moment required it. He forged alliances with smaller chieftaincies. He absorbed rivals through diplomacy where possible and military conquest where necessary. He built a professional standing army, the SOFA, disciplined, loyal, and organized along hierarchical military lines that would not have looked out of place in any European army of the era. By 1878, he had declared himself former, supreme military commander. By 1884, he took the title of Al-Momi, supreme religious and political leader, unifying temporal and spiritual authority in his own person. The Wassoulou Empire at its height stretched across what is today Guinea, Sierra Leone, the Ivory Coast, Mali, and Burkina Faso. 3 million people. Roughly 650,000 square kilometers of territory. A functioning state with a treasury, a military chain of command, a diplomatic corps, and, critically, its own weapons manufacturing infrastructure. This is where the story becomes extraordinary in ways that even most of its admirers understate. Samori Touré was not simply a warrior. He was an industrialist operating under siege conditions. Deep in the forest of Guinea, his craftsmen and engineers, trained under his direct instruction, were manufacturing and repairing rifles. Not primitive flintlocks. Repeating rifles. His smiths reverse-engineered French Chassepot rifles and later learned to replicate components of the more advanced Gros model. The workshops at Bissandegu and later at Samori's mobile capitals produced weapons that allowed his army to maintain firepower parity with French colonial forces at critical moments in the conflict. At the peak of his military capacity in the late 1880s, Samori commanded an estimated 30,000 to 35,000 infantry soldiers and a cavalry force of approximately 3,000 mounted fighters, an army larger than the entire French colonial force deployed across the whole of French West Africa at the same time. The war with France began in earnest in 1882 when French forces under Lieutenant Colonel Bognes Desbordes advanced into the Upper Niger region and demanded that Samori recognize French sovereignty over territories he controlled. He refused. What followed was not a series of desperate last stands by a people overwhelmed by superior technology. It was a 16-year campaign of strategic genius, fought on terms that Samori himself repeatedly defined. In 1882 and 1883, Samori's forces checked French advances repeatedly, forcing Paris to dispatch reinforcements and rethink its entire operational strategy. French commander Gustave Bognes Desbordes, a decorated officer who had fought in the Franco-Prussian War, wrote back to Paris with undisguised shock about the quality of the forces opposing him. At the Battle of Weyoweyanko in 1882, Samori's Sofa infantry demonstrated tactical discipline that the French officers openly compared to European professional troops. The French signed a treaty with Samori in 1886, and again in 1887, both times recognizing his sovereignty over territories east of the Niger. France needed the pause. Their campaigns were expensive, their supply lines stretched thin, and their casualty figures were becoming politically embarrassing in Paris. Samori used these treaty periods not to rest but to rearm, expand his diplomatic reach, and, crucially, to begin the most astonishing strategic maneuver of the entire conflict. When it became clear by the early 1890s that France intended to violate every treaty it had signed and push for total conquest, Samori did something no European military theorist of that era would have predicted. He moved his entire empire. What historians now call Samori's Second Empire was a forced migration of an entire civilization. Beginning around 1891 and completed by 1894, Samori relocated his capital, his army, his weapons workshops, his civilian population, and his entire administrative apparatus approximately 800 kilometers to the east, into the territory of what is today the northern Ivory Coast and western Burkina Faso. He scorched the earth behind him so that the French could not use the captured land to supply their pursuit. He destroyed crops, burned villages, collapsed wells. It was a brutal policy, one that cost his own people deeply, and Samori himself acknowledged the moral weight of that cost. But strategically, it was unprecedented. No African state of that era had ever attempted anything like it. A state of 3 million people, physically displacing itself to continue its resistance. He was buying time, expanding his reach to new resources, and forcing France to fight on unfamiliar terrain without established supply routes. Here is where the economic numbers demand to be spoken plainly. The gold corridors that Samori controlled were not symbolic wealth. The Bure gold fields, located within the Wassoulou Empire's territory, had been among the most productive gold-producing regions in West Africa for centuries. Estimates from French colonial economic reports in the 1880s suggest that Bure alone was producing gold valued at between 300,000 and 500,000 French francs annually, and that was measured at suppressed colonial pricing. Independent trade estimates suggest the true value moving through the broader Wassoulou corridor, including cola, cattle, and manufactured goods, approached several million francs per year. France's military campaign to seize this territory cost the French government an estimated 80 to 120 million francs across 16 years of active campaigning, a figure that translates conservatively to $200 million in contemporary purchasing power. They paid more to conquer this territory than it would generate in tributary revenue for the first 2 decades of colonial rule. The math was never about economics alone. It was about control. It was about the political message that no African state could successfully resist. And here is what was buried. French colonial historiography, the textbooks written in Paris and distributed across the empire, consistently characterized Samori as a slave trader, a despot, a threat to his own people. These characterizations served a precise political function. If Samori was a tyrant, then France was a liberator. If his empire was chaos, then French order was a gift. The British, who actually negotiated directly with Samori during the 1890s when he attempted to place his empire under British protection as a buffer against French aggression. The British acknowledged in their own internal Foreign Office correspondence that he was a sophisticated political actor, a capable administrator, and a formidable military commander. But that British recognition was never meant for public circulation. The colonial powers could not afford for their own population